Unfortunately, you can't grow everything that you want. And I know we just spent the last lesson making this huge list of everything you would love to grow in your dream garden, but it's time to take that list and make it a little bit more realistic, because we do have to deal with the climate that we are living in. Some of us live in hotter areas and some of us live in colder areas, and just the same plants are not going to do well in both areas, and it's really unfortunate. And the only way around this is if you were to create fully climate controlled areas for those specific plants that wouldn't normally do well in your area. And I don't know about you, but I certainly don't have those kinds of resources. So I think most of us are going to be limited to what the climate is currently like where we live. So in this lesson, we're going to go over figuring out exactly what type of climate you have beyond just like, oh, you know, I'm in a warm climate, or oh, I'm in a cold climate. We're going to go over a lot of the specifics, and then we're going to go over what that means for what you can and can't plant in your garden. And then you're going to go through your list and you are going to whittle it down into the stuff that is actually going to be realistic for you to grow in your area. If you skip this step, you're going to find that you have a lot of failures, a lot of frustration, and you might not fully understand why if you don't take the time to look into the climate that you can provide and match that to the climate that each plant needs. On the flip side, if you learn to work with your climate instead of against it, then you're going to have a much easier time gardening. If you choose plants that are going to just naturally kind of do well in your area, that is going to be less work for you as a gardener, probably more harvest and way less frustration. So the first thing that anybody thinks about when they think about what climate they live in is they think about the zone they live in, zone 6, zone 10, etc. These are USDA based zones. There's a whole map that you can look up to see what zone you're in. And if you don't live in the United States, you can still figure out what USDA zone you would be in, because the only thing that matters for the zone map is the average coldest temperature in your region. That's all it tells you. So if you can find out your average lowest temperature, then you can figure out what zone you would be. And so this is really helpful information for one type of plant. This is helpful for perennials, plants that come back year after year. This is going to tell you if the lowest temperature in your region is going to kill your perennials. Unfortunately, that does not tell you if they are going to thrive, if they are going to have a good time in the rest of everything that makes up your climate. So other things we have to consider when we're thinking about climate: the average highest temperature. For somebody like me, that is actually a really big factor, because there are a lot of things that can't grow through the heat of the summers that I have. You might have to consider humidity in your climate, because the humidity is going to kind of determine what sort of pest pressure you might have, or it might be related to how much rain your region gets, which can be a big factor in growing plants. So if you go ahead and turn to the climate page in your planner, we are going to go over the sorts of information that you need to figure out and record for your specific area before you get into figuring out whether or not your plants are going to survive there. So the first thing is going to be your average lowest temperature. This is equivalent to your zone, but knowing that number is actually, it's going to be even more helpful than knowing what exactly zone number you are. So you're going to find your average lowest temperature, and then you're going to find your average highest temperature. Like I said, both of these numbers make a difference in how well your plants are going to do. And some plants have a low killing temperature, some plants have a high killing temperature. So it's important to know these things. The next thing you're going to look up is your average humidity, and this is just going to give you kind of an idea of what the air is like throughout the year. So for me, the average humidity is very high. I have 71% humidity on average, and that contributes a lot to the pest pressure that I'm going to experience when I'm in the height of the season. Heat plus humidity is a great breeding ground for bacteria and fungi and diseases that plants might experience. So humidity is going to inform me on things like that I'm going to be facing. It might influence some of the plants that I can grow, but humidity is not the strongest factor for most plants. The next thing that I want you to figure out is what soil type you have. So do you have clay soil? Do you have sandy soil, etc., etc.? The type of soil is going to be also an incredibly important factor for what you can grow, because clay soils, especially dense ones, are going to hold a lot more water. Some plants will like that. Some plants will absolutely hate that. And then sandy soil is kind of the opposite. It's very, very well draining. And if your plants need to be holding a lot of moisture around their roots, they might really struggle in a sandy soil. So record what type of soil you have. And then the next thing we're going to look at is your frost dates. When is your last frost date in the spring? So the last time it gets below freezing. And then your first frost date in the fall, the first time it gets below freezing for the winter. And then we're going to calculate in between these dates the number of frost-free days that you have. This is your growing season for most annuals, and this is going to tell you how many days you have to actually get a harvest from a lot of these plants. So you might find that you live in an area where you can grow something like pumpkins theoretically because you're in the right temperature range, but maybe your frost dates are too close together and pumpkins need a really, really long time to mature, and you just might find that your season isn't quite long enough. So those are all the things that I want you to consider as far as like specific measurements. And then the final thing to look at is your climate classification. And so what this is kind of a more general bird's eye view of the type of climate you have, and you can combine that knowledge with all of these specific numbers that we've just taken down and get an overall perspective of what general types of plants are going to do really well for you. So I am a subtropical humid climate, and so anything that is a tropical type plant is often going to do really well here because it is well adapted to humidity and heat and things like that. So the best place to find a lot of this information, besides just straight up Googling it, is to look at specifically government websites or weather specific websites. So for the US, you can go to weather.gov and you can actually find a lot of historical weather data for your area. And I know like most weather stations will just tell you like what's happening this week. If you want to know what happened last winter or 10 winters ago, then looking at that historical data is where you're going to need to go. And if you're struggling to find like really specific numbers for some of this stuff, don't worry about it. We just kind of need an estimate. We are not meteorologists here. We're not trying to exactly predict the weather, but we just need to get a general idea of what the weather is going to probably be like. So the next page in your planner is going to actually ask you to graph the rainfall and the high and low temperatures for your region. They are going to be right on top of each other, which is really going to help you kind of line up and look at how much rainfall am I getting in each season. And I think that that can be really, really helpful because some places have dry seasons that correspond with the growing season, and that is something that would be important to know. Your average annual rainfall is not going to give you as much information as breaking it down month by month, season by season, and then lining that up with when your actual growing season temperature-wise is. Once you have all this information, you're going to go back to this dream list that we made, right? And you're going to start going through and maybe looking up high killing temperature, low killing temperature for each plant to start out with. That's going to probably weed out a lot of them. And then once you've done that, you can then look into some of the more specific stuff that each plant is going to need and think about whether or not you can actually provide that. Now, just because you don't have the perfect climate for something does not mean that you just instantly can't grow it. There are some kind of easier adaptations that we can do to make things work a little bit better. That is, much lower effort than creating an entirely climate controlled environment for this plant. So if you have clay soil and you need really well draining soil for a specific plant, then you would consider putting this plant in a raised bed where you can kind of curate the soil and offer it the drainage it needs, and kind of vice versa. So for anything where you need a specific type of soil, raised beds are really great for that. If you have a plant that's going to need a lot more rain than your region is ever going to get, then you're just going to have to know that you're going to need to invest in watering or maybe some kind of irrigation system. For me, I mostly just let the rain water my garden, and that's really convenient, but you can put in the extra effort if you are going to be growing plants that need more water. If you have a short growing season and you want to grow something that takes a little bit longer, like we were talking about with the pumpkins, one of the best things you can do for short seasons is actually start your plants indoors. And that is a thing we're going to cover later in the course, exactly how to do that. But you probably are familiar with this. If you started looking into gardening, a lot of people start seeds indoors and then transplant out later. And that is because we're trying to grow things that need a longer season than we have, or we're trying to maximize the productivity of those plants and give them more time in our gardens to be producing, even if they would technically survive if we planted them from seed. You can also either, separately or at the same time as starting ahead of time, you can look for varieties of plants that are shorter season than maybe the average plant of that type. So if you are growing maybe peppers, for example, and you need a pretty long season for that, you can look for early maturing pepper varieties. Pretty much anything is going to be good for a shorter season, and you're probably going to have more success with that if you have a shorter season. If you're like me and you live in a really humid area, then you're going to want to look for disease-resistant varieties of any of the plants that you're trying to grow. And this is going to give you the best chance of not having to deal with the sort of fungal issues that tend to come with living in a really humid climate. And then if you have a really long season, you can actually take advantage of that and say, oh, I have way more time than I need. Sometimes you can succession plant different plants and get multiple harvests throughout your season. So taking all this information, I want you to go through your entire list and think about what you can provide for each of these plants, and then come back to me in the next video with your finalized list of everything that you can actually realistically grow in your garden. And hey, I know this is already kind of a lot more homework than you might have been expecting, but I promise if you do the work now, especially with the climate stuff, you are never going to have to do it again. You will always have that information. So I highly encourage you to just go ahead and get through it, do the best you can, and I will hopefully see you in the next video very soon.